Welcome, viewers and listeners, to the Deeper Dive section of Shalom Canada. This is where we get the chance to have a more in-depth conversation with some of the very special guests that we feature and with whom you've heard part of the conversation in the main listener area. So for those of you who have already listened to our introductory conversation with Dr. Sheree Trotter of New Zealand, co-founder of Indigenous Embassy Jerusalem, we're so delighted to welcome Sheree back for that deeper dive conversation. Sheree, thank you for coming back for round 2 here. We appreciate it.
You're welcome. Good to be here.
It's a pleasure. Let's go back to, we were talking previously about the Maori people. Bring us up to speed a little bit more on the Maori people. What are some of the key elements of your history, your language, your connection to the land? And how have you and your people integrated or not into the broader life of New Zealand?
Well, early 19th century, we had people coming to New Zealand early as we had the whalers, the sealers, the missionaries, and by 1840, there was a recognition that we needed, Maori needed the British to come in and control these people who were creating havoc on our shores. That was the motivation, really, between a treaty that was signed between some Maori chiefs and just a proportion of Maori chiefs and the British Crown. In 1840, it was called the Treaty of Waitangi, named after the place where it was signed. So this established an agreement. Now, the problem with that treaty was that it was written in 2 languages, Maori and English, with slightly different wording, slightly different understandings. And so there's been a lot of debate, even till today, about the place of the treaty in society and what it actually meant, what it entailed. Were Maori handing over sovereignty to the British Crown, which is one interpretation, of course that's the European interpretation, or was it that Maori retained sovereignty over their lands and their fisheries and their treasured belongings, and the British had sovereignty over their people, which is the way Maori have understood it.
Yeah.
And of course, those are generalizations. There's a lot in between that. So it's difficult to sum up 150 plus years of history, but there's been a lot of contestation, between the peoples. On the one hand, Māori have always strived for recognition of our rights, for the return of land, have succeeded to some degree. And then we have a Māori economy today, which is worth billions of dollars, because there has been a process by which Māori have been able to take claims to the government for recompense for lands that were taken or stolen. And so it's hard to sum up in a few sentences. I would say that there's been a high degree of integration to that question amongst Māori and non-Māori. There's always been intermarriage right from the beginning. There's been a lot of intermarriage, and so Māori really are integrated into society. We have a Māori political party. This particular Māori political party has had quite an activist bent, more so than previous Māori political parties. We do have Māori electorate, so that Māori can choose to be on a Māori electorate and elect a Māori representative, but we're still in this situation of contestation between the peoples, and this shifts and changes with different governments. Previous government was really more seen as more pro-Māori and passing a lot of legislation which favoured Māori, and then of course there was a backlash to that, and so this government has pushed the other way, and so now Māori feel as if this government is very anti-Māori. So it's a complex question to sum up.
It is a complex question to sum up, and you've done an admirable job of taking a great stab at it. If you had a magic wand, so to speak, how would you like to see the Maori people develop over the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, there have been some wonderful developments amongst Māori in the last 20, 30 years. There's been a resurgence of Māori language full immersion Māori schools. And actually there's an Israeli connection to that. There was a Māori leader who went to Israel in the 90s and saw the Ulpan system of full immersion and came home, and he was one of the ones who established full immersion schools for Māori schools in New Zealand. And so we have this new young generation who have grown up in these full immersion Māori schools where Māori is their first language. And that provides a lot of hope for Māori. And we need more of that. One of the things I'd like to see is that for our children to be learning Māori is just normal, that there's no issue, there's no backlash. With the recent political developments, the last government kind of imposed from above Māori language being in government departments, being on road signs, etc. So there was a pushback from non-Māori who were saying, we don't want all this Māori language pushed on it. We don't want to hear it. But it is heard now on state TV, on radio. Māori language is heard. I would like to see a day where that's just normal and nobody's going to react to hearing Māori language.
Yes.
Again,
yes.
Israel provides a wonderful example. You go to Israel and you see on signs 3 languages, Arabic, Hebrew, and English signs, and it's not controversial at all. So I don't understand why it should be controversial here. Also, you go to Europe and many Europeans know more than one language. And so, that's one of the things I'd like to see, is that because we understand the importance of language for a culture, it gives you understanding and insight into the way people think. And that could only be good for New Zealand culture generally, is to have an understanding of who the Indigenous people are and how they think, and to be truly bicultural in that sense.
Very well said. Thank you for that. Moving on to your work with the Indigenous Embassy Jerusalem, you and your colleagues in that project, you just convened your second academic symposium in Jerusalem at the gorgeous Bible Lands Museum. And as mentioned previously, I really had the great pleasure of attending both symposia last year in 2024, alongside some very interesting academic papers. We were delighted to hear from Natan Sharansky. This year, 2025, we were treated to a stirring speech by New Zealand's Noah Paris, again, alongside many fine academic papers presented by professors and associate professors who had really done their homework on the specific topic they were presenting and held us all under their spell. These academic symposia, they're impressive, but they've got to be a whole lot of work. So you must see a benefit from these symposia to your broader project. So tell us, how do you see the role of these academic symposia in relation to your overall goals? What are these conferences meant to accomplish, and how do you measure their success? I wouldn't know how to do it, but perhaps you have some thoughts on that.
Sure. Well, firstly, I just want to say that Nova Perez is an Indigenous Australian, not a New Zealand Indigenous person. I know from Canada, sometimes it's hard to tell the difference, but no, she's been an amazing advocate for the Jewish people in Australia and globally. She's a former Olympian, a former politician, and so she has a profile, and she has used that since 7th of October to stand in support of the Jewish people and of Israel. And as she explained in her speech, part of the reason for that is that she talks about the way Jewish people have helped her people in fighting for their rights. And so there's been an allyship that has undergirded her support for Israel. So it's a very heartwarming story, and it's on our YouTube and website, Nova Perez's speech, which received a standing ovation from the audience because it was, as you say, a stirring speech.
Yes.
But yes, as you say, we have, as our first projects, held these academic symposia, and part of our reasoning for that is that we understand the importance of academia and the way that these false narratives have infiltrated through academia over decades. Actually, these false narratives have been built. And we're trying to create a body of work that speaks back to those false narratives, that unpicks them, that replaces them with the truth. So, for example, in our first symposium, we had Isabella Tabarovsky, who has done such important work in showing the Soviet background to the anti-Zionist movement, which is so prevalent today. And I was so pleased that we could have Adam Louis Klein this year, even though it was via Zoom. But Adam Louis Klein is doing very important work in helping us to understand anti-Zionism and what it is. And he's launched a movement called Movement Against Anti-Zionism. And I think this is really cutting-edge thinking. You know, he's helping to develop new language to understand this iteration of Jew hatred, which is different to the Nazi anti-Semitism and to the kind of anti-Judaism, which came from the Christian world historically. And so he's fleshing out this new language. And so by having symposia like this, we are bringing together some of these people who are at the forefront of thinking on these areas. But we also have a new unique angle as Indigenous peoples. And so last year and this year, we had some great Indigenous thinkers and academics. Last year, we had Canadian academic or lawyer, actually, Karen Restel, who did an amazing job of just showing how the Palestinian had co-opted indigeneity. And she gave a great presentation on that topic. This year we had, as well as Nova Perez, we had another Torres Strait Island woman, Loretta Pele, who talked about the importance of the sea and the ocean and brought those Indigenous understandings, but also linked it back to Israel in her thinking. And so this is another part of the work, is showing the connections between Indigenous thinking and Jewish thinking, and showing some of those Indigenous connections between our peoples. And actually this symposium was followed, I went on to a conference at Bar-Ilan University, which focused on indigeneity and was able to flesh out some of those ideas. The topic I spoke to was whether indigeneity was an ancient idea, an ancient paradigm, or a modern political construct. So there's a lot of work to be done in just beginning to dig into these topics and understanding them more clearly, and to be able to see the lies that we're being bombarded with. Another great speaker we had this year was Michael Wexler, who, using classical Arabic sources and Jewish sources, he's an expert in that area, was able to show from Islamic sources that they understood the Jewish connection to the land. He was able to prove from their own sources that this Palestinian narrative that we're bombarded with is false. So this is new work that is being uncovered, speaking directly to these things. And of course, both years we've had the honour of another Canadian, Charles Asher Small, who's supported, his ISGAP has supported both of our symposia. And of course, he is so articulate in this field of uncovering the Qatar funding last year. This year, he talked more about the Muslim Brotherhood and their impact. So it's all very compelling stuff that we're looking at.
It is very compelling, and you've just described it brilliantly, very articulately, very vividly, and it is absolutely compelling, unique work, as you said, and very powerful to see these academics and other supporters brought together to speak to their research, their experience, and the whole thing comes together in a very powerful way that counters the false narratives that have taken hold, as you said. Speaking of false narratives, we need to think about the day after October 7th, 2023. October 7th was, of course, a horrible day, but most strikingly, beginning on October the 8th, there were organized demonstrations, public demonstrations of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism around the world. And this seemed to be the start, or the starting gun being fired for the latest surge of public anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism. And many of us found that counterintuitive. One might have thought that there might be spontaneous marches in sympathy for the victims of the terrorist massacre, the civilians who were brutally killed on October the 7th when Hamas, the Islamic terrorists, invaded Israel and slaughtered as many civilians of all ages as they could. So one might have thought that, well, there's going to be spontaneous demonstrations of support for the victims. But there was some of that. But the big news, and what really started to carry the day in news media world, were these large organized demonstrations against Israel, against Jews, anti-Semitic, and this was before Israel had even picked itself up off the ground, so to speak. So you're someone who has studied Zionism and anti-Semitism for many years. Your PhD thesis focused on Zionism. Do you have any thoughts as to why this immediate and quite organized surge of public hatred came about? And more specific to your work at the IEJ, has the IEJ encountered fresh resistance to its work as part of that surge? Or perhaps you've garnered more support? What are your thoughts on this admittedly complex question that we're asking you here, Sheree?
And I think the answer has a number of strands. We can certainly see what's happened in academia over decades, building this anti-Israel, anti-Zionist movement, not just academia, but also in organizations like the UN, and activist movements that have captured people here, like the Indigenous people here in New Zealand. So from that point of view, the Indigenous activists here were captured in the 90s with the anti-apartheid movement and these international movements of the Black consciousness movement. They were aligned with the Marxist roots with Arab connections. So it was the Green-Red Alliance, which started back in, I would say, the 70s and 80s and captured Māori academics here and activists here, which has developed over decades. So that's one strand, and that's one of the strands that Isabella and others, Naya Lect is another academic who speaks well to this topic. But in addition to that, in more recent decades is settler colonialism, which has come through academia, and settler colonialism has captured countries like New Zealand. You know, we are in a settler colonial kind of paradigm right now, where we are seeing our history through this model. And there are some key thinkers like Patrick Wolfe, who said that settler colonialism is not an event, it's a structure. And he talks about invasion being this, it's like an original sin. And the goal of the settler colonialist theory is to understand these structures of power and power dynamics. The intention is to attack the institutions, these colonial institutions, which are actually all the institutions of Western society. It includes government, it includes academia, includes the science establishment. So this is all seen as part of the problem within the settler colonial paradigm, which is why I've focused on one of those academic strands in the recent symposium.
Yes.
So there are these academic strands, these activist strands. The UN, of course, has been complicit in all of this, but I think there are also other bad actors that have been at work, like Qatar, who has funded American universities and turned them into hotbeds of anti-Semitism. And I think we are now uncovering the role of Russia, the role of China, these areas still to be discovered further. But there has been a very huge concerted campaign to attack Israel and to attack the Jewish people. And, you know, we're only really scraping the surface of that campaign.
So
the second part of your question, of course, was how the IEJ has fared in that.
Yes.
And shortly after 7th of October, our organisation did come under scrutiny by local Māori academic who wrote an article saying, make no mistake, there is no Indigenous support for Israel. And so her approach was really just to see us as being part of this colonial establishment. She basically undermines the credentials of any Indigenous person who stands with Israel because she sees Israel as a colonialist project, and therefore if you support Israel, you are part of supporting a colonialist project. Of course, one of the things about these theorists is that they're not very careful with facts. They don't respect historical facts. So she makes a big deal of the doctrine of, what is it called now, discovery, the doctrine of discovery. So this doctrine of discovery was not part of the New Zealand story at all. It was never used by anybody in the establishment or the settlement of New Zealand. But for many of these theorists, they don't really care about the facts. They just cherry pick information to support an argument which sounds good, but it's actually not factual. And I guess this is part of what we're trying to do with our work, is to actually address the lies, bring the facts to the table, and try and shift the narrative for those who are interested in the truth. Admittedly, a lot of people don't care, but for those who do care, we want to give them the information that they need to hear.
It's very powerful, and I think very realistic, as even if it is swimming against the tide in some countries or some circles, I believe it is absolutely powerful. Pendulums tend to swing, and we may be in an extreme mindset in some countries now, but that doesn't necessarily last forever, and eventually a return to facts and historical accuracy, as well as the intrusive role of other countries, some of whom you've named, and of alliances. You mentioned the Green-Red Alliance, with the hard work that you and your organization is doing, as well as many, many others around the world. Eventually, I believe the pendulum will be pushed back as more facts and more disclosure and uncovering of what's really been going on in terms of spinning some of these fake narratives. Let's move on to the IEJ's work in Israel, and just give us a flavor, if you would. How has the government of Israel responded to the efforts of the IEJ? How have they approached it? And also just the people of Israel. What can you tell us about the response you've had from the Israelis themselves to the IEJ's work?
Well, Israelis, of course, are very positive and grateful and thankful. And, Israelis are just thankful for anyone who's standing up for them at this time. It's been such a traumatic period for them. The Israeli government has been supported. Gil Hazgil was at the opening event, announced the embassy as the 100th embassy in Israel. She's no longer deputy mayor, but Fleur announced it as the 5th embassy in Jerusalem. And we've met with a few government ministers, very supportive of what we're doing. I just want to share another little story that's a very positive story that's kind of related to our conversation, and it's another
Please.
aspect of the work that we would want to see happening more. That there was a recent delegation, a Maori delegation, that went to Israel. It wasn't organised by our organisation. It was organised by an Israeli friend who lives here in New Zealand. And she was able to take a delegation to Israel. And this group weren't necessarily supporters or friends. In fact, some of them were quite anti. But she had developed relationships with them and agreed for them to come and see for themselves. And so they went. And by the time they returned, they'd had their eyes opened, their hearts had been changed completely. They were apologizing for not understanding. And it was a powerful and accessible project. And that's something that we want to see more of. We want to be able to take more delegations, because there's nothing like going there and seeing for yourself the reality and the truth. And that's, so powerful for changing hearts and minds.
That is a wonderful story. Very positive, and I couldn't agree with you more. There's nothing like seeing things firsthand rather than from afar, based on whatever sources one may come across. So wonderful story about that Maori delegation. All of the efforts that you're involved in, IEJ specifically, Indigenous Embassy Jerusalem, it takes money. People know of Paris coming from Australia, and you and some of your colleagues from New Zealand and others from Latin America, and of course the Israeli researchers, and it takes money. How is IEJ funded? And do you have support in Canada? Would you like more support in Canada in terms of funding? Tell us a bit about the financial side of things.
Sure. Well, we've been working on this for a couple of years, working very hard, and most of the work has been done on a voluntary basis. I would say the majority of work has been done on a voluntary basis, and people have been generous in giving their time to come to these symposia, and they obviously see the value in it. We have managed to raise funds to be able to do the work. We've had wonderful supporters, the likes of ISGAP, the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism Policy, and the Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation, the Israel Institute of New Zealand. And of course, the Canadians have been very supportive in this, and we're very thankful for that. We do recognise that in order to keep going and to grow the work as we think it needs to grow, that we need some serious support, and we are not. We have many, but fundraising is not one of them. And I mean, the irony in all of this is the accusations you get, of course, from your opponents. They're always asking about, who's funding you and Israeli funders and your Israeli mouthpieces. And a part of me is thinking, well, I wish. But, I've even had accusations from the odd Jewish person who is disgruntled with us, saying that I'm apparently getting rich and famous off the backs of the suffering of the Jewish people. And to that kind of thinking, I go back to what I started with, was that I made a choice to pursue an avenue, when I had the opportunity to choose a topic that would give me a great career. I acted on my heart, which was that I wanted to do something connected to Israel, and that did not give me opportunity in academia, nor will it. And I understood that. So, I think people need to sort of step back a bit sometimes from these accusations. And the reality is it has been a labour of love, and it has been a lot of labour, I will admit that. But, I believe that people will see. I see it as like a startup. When you're starting something, there's always a period where you're investing a lot of effort, time, you believe in it, you're passionate, you have a period where you have to invest in order to get it going so that people can see what it is you're trying to do. And so I feel that the last 2 years have been like the startup phase. But of course, to keep a startup going, you do eventually need to get some decent funding behind it. And we're at that stage now. We're ready to receive the funding.
Fair enough. I think it's a tremendous startup. And of course, Israel is sometimes called a startup nation. So you've got the right connection there. I think it's a tremendous amount of work that you've done. I can see the even greater potential. So for those in Canada or elsewhere listening or watching with us today, you can go, and I encourage you to visit the Indigenous Embassy of Jerusalem website. It's easy to find. There is a donation page. Click on that if you're at all motivated, and I hope you are, to lend some support to this absolutely unique and hardworking organization that is doing terrific work. And I can vouch for that work firsthand, having attended both symposia so far and followed some of the other work going on. So they absolutely deserve our support. And I encourage everyone to consider donating to IEJ through their website, and I certainly hope you will. All right, Sheree. Well, to close on a less formal note here, you, your husband, and even your kids, you visited Israel and Jerusalem multiple times now. So we want some of your personal recommendations. Next time any of us are in Israel, whether it's Jerusalem or elsewhere in the country, tell us, where should we be going for falafel? Where's your go-to for hummus? What's your favorite park, museum, concert hall, coffee joint? Give us a couple of personal recos for our next visit to Israel.
Well, that's a big question, but I'm always drawn to Jerusalem. I love Jerusalem. I love being in the old city. We've found an apartment that we love to stay at, which is near First Station. I don't know if any of your listeners will be aware of First Station, with used to be a train station, I believe, and it has a number of cafes. But extending off from First Station is this lovely tree-lined walkway, and we would go for our morning walks along this walkway. And we've noticed last time there've been a lot of pop-up cafes along this walkway.
Oh.
And so we've grown to love this little area that we gravitate towards. And a tip for those like us who end up in Jerusalem on Shabbat, haven't prepared, don't have groceries in the cupboard, of course everything's shut. We discovered the American Colony Hotel, which is a beautiful hotel with a very rich history, but it's open on Shabbat for non-Jewish people who are not quite prepared for Shabbat. And it's just a place that we also love to go and have a meal there, and it's beautiful. They've got a beautiful courtyard, and there's an interesting history there with the people you can see a wall of the various famous people who have stayed there. Probably even better if you can stay there. Those are a couple of suggestions.
Those are great. All right. So the pop-up cafes, and there are many pop-up cafes. I've seen them as well, along that tree-lined boulevard in Jerusalem, and the American Colony Hotel on Shabbat. If someone is caught unprepared, as you say, those are some great personal steers. Thank you for that. Duly noted, and that brings us to a close of this deeper dive conversation. We so appreciate your time, the education you've given us on the Maori people, and of course on your fantastic work with the IEJ and the other related projects. So on that note, Dr. Sheree Trotter, thank you so much for speaking with us today from New Zealand. We appreciate it very, very much, and we look forward to speaking with you again.
Thank you, Liz. It's been a pleasure.